Democracy Now! Is underwritten by the French Broad Food Co-op, a grocery store focusing more on people than profit by providing living wages, supporting local farmers, and being community-owned. Citizens have a voice in how the co-op functions. Everyone can shop, and anyone can join.
You're listening to WPVM LP 103.7 Asheville.
You're listening to the BLAINESWORLD show, heard each Wednesday and replayed Saturday at the same time, here on the new WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina. You can also listen online at www.wpvmfm.org and also on WPVM's Facebook page, if hopefully Facebook Live is working. And Tebbe, you can work it. Say hello to all the people on Facebook Live there, and I think it's working.
Hello, everybody. How are you?
Okay, I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and each week we focus on the Asheville theater scene, as well as on positive news and information about people and organizations in the Asheville area. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce my first guest, a friend of mine, Tebbe Davis, who's an artist, poet, historian, and tour guide. Welcome, Tebbe.
Nice to be here.
Okay, well, it's
My
nice
pleasure.
Okay, it's nice to have you. And I should tell folks, Tebbe is a modern Renaissance man. He's a multi-talented and uber creative individual who has honed over the past 40 years through numerous books of poetry, renowned to Scotland, and managed local Asheville by walking under Tebbe. When you were a little kid, and where did you grow up in, by the way? Where were you?
I grew up all over the country. I was born in San Francisco, but I actually grew up in 8 different houses in 5 different states before I was 12 years old.
And when you were moving around there, did you always know you wanted to be a guy who did a lot of different things?
Yeah, I guess so. I was always very crafty, hands-on, sketching, artist, all kinds of things, even when I was like a 4-year-old child.
And did you take art lessons at some point in time?
Never.
Never? Even when you got older, when you were in school, or?
I took an art class in college.
Yeah, that was it?
Yeah, it was a sculpture class.
And so I like how you describe yourself. You describe yourself as a Renaissance man.
What does that mean?
Exactly.
What is your definition of a Renaissance?
Well, that's what I'm asking you. You're the guest.
Asking me.
Right.
Oh, all right. It's your show. All right.
Exactly. It's not your show.
I think a Renaissance man who is back to a simpler time where it's not as complicated. I like, much to the chagrin of my wife, that I like to find a way to live a life that's stress-free. And that's like living above board, no hidden agendas, and kind of being upfront with everybody I deal with. And I like to leave people happier than when I found them. The thing about the Renaissance man, to me, it represents a creativity, a sense of always finding new ways to express yourself or to do things in general, within reason, of course, because sometimes we don't have the resources to do something that we imagine in our creative intellect. And so we're forced to kind of make do, kind of jury rig, as I would say, to make something happen for yourself. And a lot of times in my art, I'm not going to rest on previous methods of making art. I like to find new ways of finding new images. And sometimes it's just, I spend the first 3 or 4 hours with a canvas just playing. There is no preconception of where it's going. There's no preconception of what colors I'm going to use. It's just like squirt, squirt, rub it around, and let it dry for a day or two, and then spend time in the studio turning it side to side to side and seeing what comes out and then adding something to it. And before you know it, you have something that looks like this.
And folks on Facebook Live can see it. For the benefit, beautiful piece that Tebbe, for the benefit of the people who can't see it, describe what they're looking at.
Are they blind, or is this radio? This
Well,
is radio. Okay.
radio. Some people are on Facebook Live, but some people are listening.
Well, what I did is I smeared a whole bunch of paint, different colors, different, and the original on this particular piece, and this ended up being 3 waterfalls in the woods. And the original is about 5 feet wide. So there was a lot of gesticulations with the shoulders and the hands rubbing on things. And before you know it, I saw these 3 images come out, and I just started playing with them and working them. And I said, oh, I could make those into waterfalls.
So when you did that piece, you were not looking at 3 waterfalls at the time?
Absolutely
That's
not.
all your imagination?
Total imagination.
Interesting. Do you ever go to a place where you say, hey, that's really beautiful and I want to paint it? So you'll sometimes actually do the actual picture of something. Yeah.
The good Lord has invented a thing called a camera.
Can you imagine?
Can you imagine that?
There was a time when there wasn't one?
There was?
Yeah, wow.
Oh, I don't know if I could have existed then.
How do you use the camera?
Because what I do is I will go out every day wherever I am, and if I see something interesting and see something that's unique or just generally beautiful, I'll start taking pictures. And I might come back at the end of a day and have 50 or 60 photographs on my phone, and I'll just throw out 40 of them because they're stupid and keep 5 or 10 of them. And a lot of those things end up in paintings. Maybe not that image, but something in that image. If it's just a composition, if it's just a color thing, or just a flower pushing up through a piece of concrete.
So what, you'll then go back and look at some of the images and they stick in your mind and then you base your paintings on it?
Well, if you recall that I smear paints and I just have fun, a lot of those paintings are sitting in my studio waiting for me to get back to them to see what's there. And sometimes I'll be in town and I'll see an alley in Asheville. And in the end of the alley, and I think it's right across the street here, there's an alley up across from the old Europe Cafe. And at the end of the alley is the St. Lawrence Basilica. And the alley frames the St. Lawrence Basilica. I've painted that painting because the negative space of the alley had this shape to it that I just couldn't resist. And I put the St. Lawrence Basilica in the middle of it. And so I had these old decrepit buildings, and it was while the Cambria was being built that I did this. So the left-hand side of the painting was the back side of where the Cambria is now, and there was a wall there that used to have an abstract mural on it. And so I painted the mural in the painting with the basilica and the alley negative space, and then the parking lot. It was just a cool painting, and I sold that through the Mountain Maid at the Grove Arcade.
How many paintings are you working on at one time?
Anywhere from 5 to 10.
So do you ever just sit down and finish a whole painting at one time?
Sometimes. Yeah. As a matter of fact, right now I'm working on a project with Tyler Barnwell up in Madison County with about a dozen other artists, and we're doing the old tobacco barns of Madison County. And so right now we're all going out in caravans looking at these barns and taking pictures. And I did a barn just last week where I started on Monday and worked it until it was done. It took 10 days. And I finally finished that. And I had people all over asking me how much I want to buy that. But I want to save it for the exhibition on June 21st up in Madison County.
Do you have any, if you can just grab that, that'd be great.
Grab
okay.
what?
Turn.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Do you have any favorite things like painting?
No. Everything.
Yeah.
I have, if somebody looked at my portfolio of what I've done in the last 5 or 6 years, they would say I love trees because I love trees. But trees are sometimes just a fingerprint. They're all different, yet they're all come from a finger. So it's like a tree is a very unique, every tree is different, but yet you have your fir tree and your deciduous trees and your oaks and your elms and your birch and whatever. I just like the shape on the skyline.
Anyways, I think you did a painting for our house, which we love, and I think there's some trees in that too, or most of the stuff I'll see.
You have the Swananoa River, I think.
And,
with the
right.
heart shape up
Yeah.
on top in the trees.
Which you just love it.
Yeah.
You know, and just when Cynthia saw it, she said, wow, she had to have that. But that's kind of interesting. So
Cynthia is Blaine's wife, a very lovely woman.
My beautiful bride.
A beautiful bride.
We'll say there as well, though.
I got to turn this
Yeah,
off.
that's
This
what I
thing's
was
making noise.
That's what I was suggesting, Tebbe. So you talking about your art then. So as a kid, you started drawing and painting and doing all that good stuff. When did you get serious about it, that you knew you wanted to be doing it, you wanted to be selling the stuff as well?
There's a couple of different turning points in my life. One was when I was in college and I was writing, and I was a philosophy major, and I was doing poetry, and I made a serious effort to publish some of my poems, which I did in a book called The Helix. And then recently, I've always painted. I've always been a painter. But recently I went to this is, 6 years ago, 2012? I think it was actually the 12th of December, 2012. I was watching a live demonstration of a local artist, and he had music playing, and he was dancing around, and don't even say it.
No,
and
but
so,
I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah, and I said to myself, if that guy can do that and make money, then I can do that and make money. And I had a conversation with that artist, and he wanted to sell me a piece of art so bad because I was interested. And finally, at the end, he just turned around and says, you know what? You sound like you could probably do this yourself. Why don't you go try that? And so I did.
I remember you told me that story,
Yeah.
and right around the time, maybe that's when I first met you.
Yeah, it was when we first met, about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And that was still fresh in my mind. That was still an inspiration for me. But at the time, I was working for Sundance Power Systems, selling solar systems, creating, designing sustainable energy devices for people's homes and businesses. And I quit that job and went right into painting.
On a full-time basis?
On a
at that time?
full-time,
Yeah.
it's the only way I could make money.
And that was kind of a risky
Oh,
thing to
you
do.
think so? Talk to my wife. Yeah, we didn't have a deep conversation about it, and I kind of shocked her when I did it. But I just came to the point where I was, at the time, I was like 55 years old, and I said, I'm not going to go through the rest of my life thinking I coulda, shoulda, woulda. I said, you know, we have a little money, we have a little equity, well, she had a pension starting just then, and we just said, go for it. And I've never looked back. And since then, I've actually started with the Asheville by Foot walking tours, which supplements my income.
Well, talk about that, too, because that's kind of
Okay.
interesting, because I hadn't even read that until you got your background. I knew you were doing the painting. I knew you were doing, you do just about everything. I've seen you act. I've seen you do poetry. I'll tell you one other thing I saw you do once that knocked my socks off. We were at Jubilee one time, and you showing Cynthia and everybody else how to tie a scarf, though. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And it's just, where did you get that skill, and where did you learn it? And then you can show other people, but you just can do some
Well, I
stuff.
will put a shout out. That scarf tying technique that I used, I got from Laura Masterson,
Okay.
from Laura's Yum, who's
Right.
passed since then. And she taught me how to do that particular thing. So I just want to make mention that I don't always come up with brand new things, but I do have a way of borrowing them.
But it's just so cool. We just had Jubilee and
You took a
talking.
video of that, right?
Yeah, I
as I
did.
recall. Yeah,
and
yeah.
I had to, because something I couldn't figure out how to do it, and you just did it.
And you took a video of it so you could remember.
No, so I could sell it to people and make some money on this. I didn't want to tell you that, Tebbe.
I want my 50%.
I told you 50% you get of being on the show today. You get
Thank
50%
you
of
so kindly.
what I get.
You're such
So,
a good man.
But talk to me about the tours, too, because all of a sudden I saw that you're doing tours now, and what brought that on?
Well, it goes way back. When I first got here in 2003, I had a friend who was a volunteer at the Chamber of Commerce when it used to be over here before they built the new place. And I went there to speak with her, and there was somebody who didn't show up for work that day, volunteer. And so I went behind the counter, and I spent that afternoon sharing maps upside down with people that were tourists in town. And I only lived here for 3 weeks. And I did that for 3 years.
That was a volunteer?
As a volunteer,
Yeah.
I was an ambassador for
Right.
the Chamber of Commerce, and my graphic design business at the time was a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and I was one of the ambassadors. And I stayed with the Chamber for about 3 years and actually was involved in the urban trail development. When they first did the urban trail and put little plaques on the sidewalk, and we had a PDF of the whole device. So I was always interested in the history and the architecture of Asheville. As a matter of fact, when I was in Connecticut, I was an architectural photographer, and I was very much interested in the various facets of what is in this town. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, my friend Dr. Kevin Frazier from Western Carolina University History Department, he's a provost at the Biltmore campus, the Biltmore Park campus. And he started this company where he was just doing walking tours around town. So I got involved with him, and now I'm the primary manager of the business. We have 3 tour guides, including Kevin and Rick Fornoff and Sharon Ferrer.
Oh, I know Sharon, sure.
Sharon's from the History at Hand people up in Montfort. Right. But so we do the tours. I do the scheduling and all the customer interaction and what have you. But it's just a hoot because I just love walking around town telling the stories of Asheville. And Asheville has some incredible stories.
And knowing you, even if they're not true, you just make them up. You know.
Yeah, well, here's what I tell the people when I start the tour. I said, 50% of what I'm going to tell you is total crap. You have to decide which 50% that is.
How long are the tours?
90 minutes to 2 hours.
Okay, it's just about perfect
It's a
length.
It's a 2-mile walk through town on a leisurely basis. And I take people up to the top of the AC Hotel so they can see the whole cityscape from the rooftop restaurant up there, which is very nice. You can see the First Baptist Church. You can see the Grove Park Inn. You can see Mount Pisgah. And you can see Cold Mountain up there. And it's just a great thing. Once in a while, I have some friends that live in the Battery Park Apartment Arms.
Right.
Battery Park Arms
I think
Apartments.
so, yeah.
Yeah. And they'll let me in, and I can take people up to there.
And that's a beautiful view,
oh,
too.
That is the best view in town. And that is actually the apartment that Edwin Grove died in. Do you know how Edwin Grove died?
No. Edwin Grove died.
Edwin Grove had a problem with hiccups. As it turned out, years later, it was discovered that hiccups are caused by drinking too much quinine. And as you know, the Grove Chill Tonic that he made his fortune on was 50% quinine and 40% vodka and cherry juice. That was the magic formula. But he drank so much quinine, he got the hiccups. In the last 20 years of his life, he could not breathe without hiccuping.
Yeah.
And he was at a dinner party, and he was eating oysters with champagne, getting drunk, and he choked on an oyster, and no one knew the Heimlich maneuver.
Oh, wow.
Because Heimlich had not been born yet.
And so that's a little known
Little known
factoid.
fact. And he died in that apartment on the top of the Battery Park Hotel, the 3 big windows up on
Right.
top. That was his apartment.
Beautiful apartment. Another view, I don't know if you've ever taken people up, top of Hemingway's. Have you ever been up there?
No, I have not.
You know Hemingway's? It's
No.
a Cuban restaurant.
Where's
You
it located?
Check it out. It's one of the new hotels right by the Wall Street Garage, right around the corner from the Wall Street
Okay.
Garage, the hotel. And they have a beautiful restaurant, Hemingway's, and on top they have a view. But interesting, you're telling the story that...
You talking about the Sky Bar in this building?
No, the Hemingway's, just the new hotel opposite, right by the Wall Street Garage.
Oh, Cambria.
Yeah, Cambria,
Yeah, okay.
that's it.
All right,
Anyway,
yes.
but the point is, what's interesting, you're talking about the view, the people in the apartments aren't real happy there because they had this beautiful view of all Asheville, and then on top of that, they have to get the music, playing from the open bar. But just check that out sometime. You really
yeah.
like the view. But, so you did the tours. Then fast forward to there, not only those tours, but then you also every so often go to Scotland to do tours.
Yeah,
And what brought that on?
Well, about, I don't know how many years ago, my wife and I went to Scotland. And in researching Scotland, I came across this young man named Mark Nichol, who was a local historian and filmmaker from the Scottish borders. And I reached out to him, and through a series of emails, I invited myself into his life for one day. And he met us in a place called Melrose in the Scottish borders and gave us a tour of various abbeys and castles and towns and villages in the Scottish borders. And it just got me thinking, because I asked him, I said, can I pay you for the day? He said, no. But he was such a good tour guide. I called him back about a week or two later when we got home, and I said, would you be willing to be a tour guide if I brought people to you? And he said, I'd love to. And so we developed this Touring Scottish Borders. That's the name of the website, touring.scottishborders.get this, XYZ. Not
Okay.
.com, .xyz. So that's, we do tours twice a year, once in the spring, once in the fall. Well, fall, like October, like September, October.
How many people go on those tours?
12 to 15.
Okay.
I think that's a good sized group. It gives us extra room on the bus, and whether you have 15 people or 27 people, the bus is the same size.
But why Scotland? Do you have a background?
My background's Welsh. I'm Welsh by
Okay.
ancestry, but Scotland is just gorgeous, and the Scottish borders has a certain history that goes back to the Romans, because Hadrian's Wall, which was the Romans' barrier between England and the barbarians of Scotland, as they call them, or the Caledonians. And the wars went on from that point all the way into the 1700s with the Scottish, the Church of England, Protestant Reformation, King Henry VIII, Mary Queen of Scots. All that stuff is tied in with the Scottish borders because all those battles happened in that area, south of Edinburgh, north of Newcastle.
Well, I know also that's another interest of yours because I'm always looking on Facebook, and you're going with Susanna. You travel different places with Susanna all the time. You had one long tour you had recently was, where was it?
Scottish borders.
No, but aside from Scottish borders, it was with Susanna to...
we went to the Isle of Skye.
Yeah, talk about that.
This is the third time we've been there. And the Isle of Skye is an area in the Highlands, in the western Highlands of Scotland. And it's an island, but really it's a peninsula, just separated by like a half-mile spit of land, so it is technically an island. But it's probably the most beautiful landscape in the world. Scotland is considered the most beautiful country in the world by National Geographic and other travel people. But the Isle of Skye has desert, has mountains, has spires, has coves, has little bays, ragged coastline, more sheep than people. And there's a couple little towns and villages that are absolutely gorgeous. And actually, St. Columba was one of the first settlers in Scotland. Now, St. Columba is not Columbus, but it's Columba, and Columbus was named after him. And he was the patron saint of livestock.
Now, when you're traveling, are you also doing your artwork?
Not really, because it's very difficult for me to carry my oil paintings and canvas. And I mean, I could take a plein air pack with me, but for my style of painting, it doesn't translate well in the field.
So you're just taking pictures then?
Taking pictures and sketching, a lot of sketching.
Well,
a lot of sitting on the side of the road just drawing something out.
Well, I was also thinking of another trip you took, was it a year or 2 years ago with Susanna? It was to someplace, it was a retreat, or it was a, not a Buddhist retreat, but didn't you go with Susanna for a long period of time away from civilization?
That was 10 years ago.
No, it wasn't 10.
Yeah.
No, wasn't there one more recently where you went, the two of you went someplace and it was, you had to give up all?
Well, we did go to Peru.
Maybe it was Peru. I was thinking something was very rustic, or you had a very rustic existence.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Colorado. We went to
Okay.
Durango. We went to visit a friend in Durango, and they have a dude ranch.
Was that it? Yeah.
And they do expositions up in the mountains, and we took 2 weeks and just went off the grid.
Okay.
And we drove the San Juan Skyway, which goes from Durango to Silverado to Ouray, then around the mountains to Telluride, and then went down to Mesa Verde, and then went to this little town called Montrose, which is right on the New Mexico-Colorado border, and it is a town that is regentrifying itself to be an artist community, an artist colony. And so we were looking at that. But then we went to Peru and we went to Scotland, and I forgot about going back there.
No, it was Peru, I think it was, that you went to.
Really?
Or
Okay.
something. But anyway, yeah, it's just to follow you.
We like to travel.
I was going to say, it's hard to remember
like
where you are any
Me
particular
too.
day. Exactly. Well, also, in addition to doing all that other stuff, you also, are you still into poetry?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's funny that you said that because when I was in college, I published 2 books of poetry. And then in 1998, after I got divorced, I spent 2 years, just all my spare time was writing poetry, and I actually published a book then. And that might even still be available. It's called Tickle My Shadow. And the poetry kind of went away as the painting took over, but in a conversation with a dear friend of mine, James Nave, who you're going to have on your show soon? Some week?
Very soon.
Okay. James Nave and I were talking one time about a month ago, and I said, geez, I'd really like to get back to poetry. I miss the poetry. James has a slam poetry things he does at Leaf, and I'm a big aficionado. And when I go there at Leaf, it's an event. And I love slam poetry because of its raw, emotional nature. But my poetry is much more introspective, and I really find that it helps me sort out things. And James just said to me, he says, well, why aren't you writing poetry then? I said, I don't know. And so in the rest of that conversation, we challenged me to write a poem a day for 100 days just to get the chops back. And so right now I'm currently writing a poem every day and sending it to James, not for critique, just to tell him, you know,
You're doing it.
I'm in this. I can handle this. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of looking at things differently. That's all poetry does for me. It helps me look at things differently.
Didn't you also, or have you ever tied in poetry to your paintings?
You're like the fifth person who said that in the last
No,
2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yes. It's always been a fantasy, an idea, something I thought would be interesting for me, if nobody else, is to take one of my paintings and write a poem about the painting and marry them together on a page in like a coffee table book. But we'll see. I like the idea.
Show another painting, then I have another question for you.
Another painting?
Yes.
This is something I did recently, and it is called Sunrise. And it is one of those paintings that I basically smeared paint until something came to me. And once that something came to me, I went with it. And that painting I made prints of it. I've sold about a dozen prints. I sold the original just the other day.
You mentioned 100 poems in a day. Weren't you also the one you told me a couple of years ago you did 100 paintings in a day? Was that you? 100 paintings in a
Yes,
100
that's
paintings
where
in
the idea
100
came
days. I thought it was brilliant. What was that?
When I first started painting professionally,
right,
and wanted to make a living at it, I needed to
sell some paintings.
trial by fire.
Right.
Not necessarily. I needed to get my chops back. I needed to get into it and paint. And so I bought a bunch of cheap canvases. They came in boxes, 16 by 20 canvases from I don't know, maybe Jerry's Artorama or one of these places on the internet. I just bought this stuff and started painting. And I'd go to my home. I had a studio in my house at the time, and I don't have a studio in my house anymore. And I painted 100 paintings, one a day. And I'd start it in the morning and finish it by dinner. Start it in the morning, finish it by dinner. Most of them ended up in a dumpster.
But it just forces the discipline.
Forces the discipline. That's exactly what it is.
Do you recommend that, by the way, to artists, to poets? You know, the idea that, and some writers try to do that, you have to just sit down.
Well, you know,
and
Malcolm Gladwell had a book years ago called Tipping Point.
Right.
And the tipping point, and I remember reading that book, and that's why I did the 100 paintings a day, and that's why I'm doing the 100 poems a day. Because if you spend time focused in one area of your life that you're passionate about, and you can spend, his number is 10,000 hours, which is a lot of hours, and you just do it. You just don't stop until it's done. You keep doing it. You can't help but get good. You get to a tipping point where you become the expert.
So are we at 10,000 hours or beyond?
I'm way beyond 10,000 hours now at that point. Not with the poetry. I mean.
Well, what's so interesting, too, is that you're saying the poetry, and whatever I've seen you in, it's kind of interesting. Another thing I'd encourage you to do more of. I love watching you act. I love watching you perform. I saw you, again, one of the first things I saw you in that production that Barry Barton did. And just, you blew me away. You had, as an actor, have you done some of that?
I have been in 47 plays in my life, going back to when I was 12 years old. I played Oliver in that Dickens song. It was Oliver, yeah.
Right.
I played one of the little kids.
Okay.
More, please.
But have you done anything lately?
Amy moved, my partner, my comedy partner, I had a comedy routine
Right.
with Amy. Latterroot. And she and her husband have since moved to Pawleys Island, so I don't see her. Nothing has really caught my attention since then.
Out of all the things you do, is there a favorite thing you do? Now you can talk about it on the air. Okay.
My mind went so dirty right there, I tell you. It just went absolute filth.
Okay, this is a G-rated show.
It's a G-rated show. If I could, I would spend all day in the studio painting. But I have 2 dogs at home, and they need to go out.
I said they need to be fed also, so you have
Yeah.
to get some for the dog food. Tebbe, if anybody wants to get more information about you, and we'll talk about, you're probably going to have to give 17 different sites, but if they want to get more information about you in general, what's the best bet?
Everything can be found on TebbeDavis.com.
Okay, and that'll have the art, that'll have the tours,
And you spell Tebbe like this.
but you don't pronounce it that way. So just spell it out for the listeners on the radio.
Tebbe.
Tebbe, art, one word, .com.
TebbeArt.com.
Okay.
Or TebbeDavis.com. It goes to the same place. And on there, there's a link to the Scottish site, and that's Discover Where You Are. It's told that. That's Touring Scottish Borders, XYZ. And I'm going to be adding this week all my new poems on a page called 100 Poetry Project.
Okay, and do we have, how many poems have we completed?
21.
21. You're looking at our next guest for an answer.
I'm writing the 21st as we speak.
Good for you, and you're actually doing a poem a day.
Poem a day.
Okay, good job. Tebbe Davis, as always, a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you very much.
And we'll speak to you soon.
All right.
Okay, buddy. And
Bye
as
now.
Tebbe works his way out of the studio, and our next guest works his way in, let me just mention two things, if I can. First of all, underwriter support for this show on WPVM is made possible by BLAINESWORLD, a blog that contains information about Asheville's theater scene, reviews, tidbits of information that you'll find useful, and some jokes that are hopefully not too risque. If you'd like to get on the mailing list with this missive, just send an email to bginbc@aol.com and put subscription in the subject line. I'd now also like to recognize some upcoming theater productions happening in the Asheville area. There's Elvis, The Early Years, a tribute to the King on his 84th birthday, and that features Peggy Rattus, who's been a guest on this show, a whole bunch of other local performers, including Aaron Price. That'll take place on Wednesday, January 8th at 8 p.m. at Ambrose West. In addition, Crimes and Misdemeanings, a comedy variety fundraiser for Arms Around ASD, will be at Magnetic Theater, January 11th to the 13th, and there'll be 5 performances for 1 weekend only, and that's the show I think you want to see. Should be a lot of fun. And talking about fun, it segues into my next guest, who Tebbe mentioned, but he is James Nave, and has a job title of poet, publisher, producer, and also radio star. We forgot that, too.
Well, the star hopefully shines brighter every day.
Every day. And welcome aboard, James.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you. And I should mention that James is a poet, producer, creative leadership consultant. He also has a show here on WPVM, which airs, when is that?
Well, I believe it airs on Friday, Sunday, and Wednesday. So I think it'll be on air this afternoon.
And James is also on the board with me on the board of directors with WPVM. He has spent over 25 years working with the power of language, creativity, and the stories we tell. He holds an MFA in poetry from Vermont College. Now this is pretty impressive. Has memorized over 500 poems.
That's right. And the real question here is, ask me how many I have forgotten.
How many have you forgotten?
I probably have forgotten 400 of them. And memorization, for me, is an interesting proposition because it's not so much what we take into our head. It's how we take it into our bodies. And so when you bring a poem or any piece of memorization into your head first, maybe, and then it goes into your heart, I learn by heart, and then it becomes part of you. So in a way, I make a joke about ask me how many I've forgotten. And the real kernel of that question is, how easy is it for me to bring those back verbally? So a lot of those I can't bring back verbally unless I sit down, look at the text, and then bring it out from some dark place that it's been resting. So if you rehearse the poems like I do often, I can lay them out verbally after 4 or 5 times, and so they start to emerge. So it's not about forgetting, it's more like how many of them have receded beyond my grasp at the moment.
Talk about that a little bit, because it fascinates me, the whole concept of memorization. And aside from poetry, have you ever acted at all?
Tebbe was just here talking about how many plays he's been in.
Right.
I've never been in that many plays, so I've never acted. And the reason why is because I've always traveled and moved around all over the place and it's hard to make a commitment to a team of people who are going to be presenting a play if you're not there the whole time for the rehearsals. That said, I've acted in more of a stand-up sense as a performance poet and as a reciter of verse, and I've been on many, many stages with lots and lots of people. I just haven't played characters, and being able to recite something from your own character essence is very different than being able to assume a role, become somebody else. That's a skill I have a lot of respect for.
Well, as you were saying, just listening to you, it's, memorization, 500 poems, you've gotten 400, you still have 100 memorized. That, to me, I have the same respect for. When I see an actor can act, in monologues, 15-minute monologues, just go straight. And the difference, I guess, between that and what you do a little bit is yours from the heart, and it can change a little bit. Is that correct? Like, if you memorize a poem, especially if it's your own poem, it can vary a little bit?
Well, it's the same. The acting technique for presenting a dramatic monologue is the same, regardless of whether you're an actor on a stage presenting a dramatic monologue within the context of a play, or whether you're presenting a poetic piece would be considered a dramatic monologue. I mean, a good example of a dramatic monologue would be My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, and it's the Duke is in the 1500s, and it's really kind of a horrible piece because the Duke has decided he didn't want the lovely Duchess that he had married, so he had her disposed of in unpleasant way.
And that seemed to be done a lot those years.
Well, I mean, it's probably in some ways it's a metaphor for a lot of things that happen all the time.
Right.
And so if you read My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, you'll find a predator who's wrapped in long robes and has lots and lots of power and exercises that power over everybody and pushes everybody into the corner he pleases and leaves them there. And if you don't like that corner, then he'll dispose of you. So it's a dramatic monologue told from the point of view of the Duke having a conversation with a fellow from another kingdom. A count, I think, was the fellow, and this was the count's representative. And so the count is making a negotiation with the Duke to have the daughter, the new wife, to come on. And so the Duke is warning the agent and telling the agent what he expects of the new wife. So from a dramatic monologue point of view, you could play that like the character of the Duke. So you could do a complete characterization of it. Now, once you go down that path, how far would you like to go? You could spend years developing a character like that. I'm not particularly interested in dwelling too deeply in the Duke's psychology because it might undo me.
Do you have a favorite poem?
I
or
have
several?
Well, no, I have lots and lots of pieces of literature that have influenced me. So when people ask me about the favorite, I like to say, yeah, poetry is a favored art form for me because it informs me. So instead of having a favorite poem, I have a number of poems that have influenced me over the years, like Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson, Fern Hill by Dylan Thomas for the summer feel. Ulysses by Tennyson is about questing. There's one by Sarah Teasdale about the rain and the birds and the animals not noticing human beings, and they don't notice if we were even gone when spring comes. If we vanished tomorrow, the trees and the animals and the birds wouldn't even notice. We would be completely gone. So poetry influences me.
How about your poetry? You mentioned 500 poems you memorized. How many poems have you written, ballpark?
How many poems have I written?
Yeah.
I don't know. And I don't mean to be flippant about that. It's like when you start to generate poetic work, some of it's poetry, some of it's not. How you can take a written piece and move it as far down the line as you want it to be in terms of crafting it. And so I have no idea how many I've written, and they're short. And as Tebbe was talking about the work that he's doing, we're collaborating a little bit with it in the sense that, we're really not collaborating. He's writing the work and sending it to me, and one of the reasons I was enthusiastic about the 100 poems in 100 days. That sounds like a lot, and it is in one way. As a creative person, and a lot of you in the listening audience are creative people, you know what it's like to make things. You get up and you start making things, and over a day's time, you might only make one thing. 10 years, you could make countless things. So making poetry is the same as making anything else. You take your elements and you put them together, and sometimes they sing and work really well, and other times they don't, and you just keep going. So my poetry is like that. So I wrote this. This is brand new, like what Tebbe does. He writes a poem and then sends it to me, and I often write a little piece and send it out to people individually. So I'll send my poem, text my poem to 50 or 60 people and think about each person. So it's the act of thinking about the person that I care about or that I love or that I'm close to, and then I think about them and I send them the piece. So this is the one I wrote I wrote it on the solstice, and it goes like this. The northern hemisphere turns toward the light today at 5:23 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Will I notice the shift when the night begins? I doubt it. Likely I'll be in afternoon traffic listening to news, wondering when someone somewhere will do something worth reporting, like it rained last night, or someone called to say hello, or the Altenif crossing is empty. Who knows? I might see a dragon, perhaps the dreaded red stripe, or the blue flame mel, or the long-tailed screecher, or the delightful mist reducer, or the grand orange scaly, a Chthonian sort of thing that flies low to the ground. Now, is that a poem? Is that a snapshot of what's going on in my psychology? Is it an interesting little piece of prose? I don't know. I wonder if it's even worth asking that question. It's something. And I love the idea of the dragons, the blue flame mel, the long-tailed screecher, the delightful mist reducer. I mean, what in the world is a delightful mist reducer? What would that dragon look like? So when you write poetry, or when you write or let your imagination go in whatever direction it wants to, you'll end up with something like the delightful mist reducer, and then that'll take you somewhere.
When you write that, are you writing it on your cell phone? Are you writing it at home? Where are you writing it?
I am writing this on the notes on my iPhone. I use whatever tool is at hand, and I like to write this on my iPhone using, sometimes I dictate it and sometimes I'll write it with my finger. And the reason why is because of all the writing tools I have, this one has least emotional I have almost no emotional connection to this. When I can type with the keyboard. So when I'm typing ASDFJKL semicolon, and I learned how to type in high school, and I don't have to look at the keyboard, I can just type away, but I have an emotional connection to that. I have a relationship with it. When I write longhand I use a Waterman pen. So when I write with my longhand with Waterman pen, it's like drawing. So I have a different kind of an emotional response to that movement. And those emotional responses thread back over the years. Somehow using the notepad is neutral. And that neutrality, it gives me a sense of freedom.
One of the things I loved what Tebbe said in the first part of the show was kind of your challenge to him, too. It's just the idea to have people start writing, be it poetry, short stories, music. The key is you have to begin somewhere. And I guess that's...
Well, I mean, we do have to begin. And in a sense, we have to begin almost every day. But you do have to begin somewhere, and the key is to start expressing yourself. And that could be, for most of us, we generally know how to write because we learned how to do that early in our education. So for most of us, that's a good place to begin exploring what it might mean to get the thoughts you have in your head together in a way that are expressed with some kind of organization.
When you began exploring, do you remember when you first started writing poetry?
I don't really remember when I first started writing poetry. I first started getting really interested in it from the point of view of officially writing it when I was traveling around with the business I had called Poetry Alive, and I've on my show, Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to, which I broadcast here. I've often talked about Poetry Alive and the work that I did early on, and that's how come I memorized the 600 poems, because we were asked to go into schools and do performances for students in auditoriums and cafeterias and gymnasiums or wherever, sometimes classrooms. So we would perform the poems from the school textbook. And the reason I memorized so many was because the teachers would send us a list. They'd say, we need you to memorize these and perform them. So we would more or less get them memorized and overact. And it was, in some ways, it was terrible acting, but it was really great fun. So I started writing poetry with a little more intention when I realized, well, I know all of these pieces. Let's see what happens if I try to take my own experience from my interior and put it out on the page. I didn't really get serious about it till I was in my 40s. I did write before that. I'd always dabbled and written and whatnot, but not officially.
Talk about something you just mentioned. You were going into schools. I have a recollection now, as you're speaking about it, that I had to memorize poems. You know, it was told that we're studying poetry, and today you have to memorize this poem. Good or bad idea?
It's a great idea. It's a really, really good idea to memorize poetry. It's probably one of the best things that you could do for yourself. It's the way it's been taught has been a bit off the mark. And what I mean by that, when you are in school and the teacher asks you to memorize a poem, people report, they said, let's memorize Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening would be one that would be a classic that everybody had to memorize. So the whole class is asked to memorize the thing, and it's like, whose woods these are? I think I know his house is in the village, though he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. And it goes on. It's a very rhymey piece. And so you go home, and what you do is, as a student, and I'm being general here, but I suspect I've heard so many stories, I'm willing to be a little general, but students will go home and they'll take the piece and they'll sit down and they'll try to memorize it. Whose woods these are? Whose woods these are? Okay, do I have that? Whose woods these are?
Sounds like me.
I think I know his house is in the village, though. Okay, maybe I can remember. Whose woods these are? What was it? I think I know. Oh, I think I know. So here's a little poetic device. I think I know. What's the difference between thinking and knowing? And does thinking generate a knowing? So writing the first line of I think I know is a very complicated proposition. It's an intellectual question we could pursue for hours, right? Well, you're in the 5th grade. You're not going to be pursuing it. You're just trying to remember, I think I know. Does I think come before I know? Does I know become before I think? So you get this chatter going on. And then you try to get the poem down. And you finally think you get it down, and then you go to recite it. You know, I'm going to recite this in front of the class, and you get to I think I know it, and you're in the second line, and you fumble it. And you make a mistake, and the teacher says, oh, you didn't get it right because you made a mistake. Now, if you'd had a math problem, had a math test, and you had gotten 19 out of 20 problems right, you'd get an A. If you have a poetry recitation class or presentation, and you miss a couple of lines, you fail. So the memorization is gone. People approach memorization in the wrong way, really. Because memorization isn't about learning the words. It's about imagining into the piece until somehow you have it. And you actually don't remember when the words finally fell into place. So in, say, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, instead of going, whose woods these are, I think I know his house is in the village, though he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So the student's trying to memorize the rhyme, and okay, or you could say, whose woods these are? I think I know. His house is in the village, though he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it's queer to stop without a farmhouse near, but between the woods and the frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year, he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there's some mistake. The only other sounds, the sweep of easy wind and downy flake, Well, the woods are lovely, dark and deep. But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Same poem, same rhymes, and yet I'm trying to imagine into it rather than trying to recite it, which you come back around. That's acting.
Have you ever taught poetry?
I've taught a lot of poetry, yeah.
But like in a college class or
Well, when we did the schools, I traveled around,
Well,
yeah, but I never had a college class where I would show up on September the
Right.
1st and like at the end of the semester carry it all the way through.
Just listening to you, which I never had a great interest in poetry. You said, boy, I would have loved to have had you as a poetry teacher.
Well, I do a lot of work with Allegra Houston, and she and I have a business in Taos, New Mexico. It's a publishing business named the same as the radio show, Twice 5 Miles Guidebooks. And we produce guidebooks for people around poetry and how to edit. And she and I have done a lot of workshops over the years for adults. So we'll do a week-long seminar. So I've taught a lot of poetry, but I've never taught it in a classroom, although a week-long seminar would be the same length as a classroom.
Sure, exactly. Well, it's funny because that's how I think you caught my attention. We were at a meeting, and you had these two books, and I just loved the title of it, the graphics of it, the whole bit. But this book was, what was this book?
It's called How to Read for an Audience, and since we're on Facebook, for those of you who happen to be listening in or looking in, you can see the title, How to Read, and it's a how-to series, and they're all under 100 pages, and they're very simple.
Which
Very,
I
very
love.
simple.
You had a bunch of these, right?
Well, we have two right now, How to Read for an Audience and How to Work with a Writer. And How to Work with a Writer is really a way of editing, learning what it's like to be in a relationship with an editor. Even if it's you are in a relationship with yourself and you are the editor. Yeah, and so that's a second book, and this one was the first, How to Read for an Audience. And it's how to give a powerful public reading. So it's for people who have written a book and they don't know a thing about it. And they would somebody invites them to come to a house concert or maybe come to the local bookstore and read, and you'd like to get your work out. You would like to feel good in front of an audience, but you just don't have any information about how it works. Like, when does the show start? The show starts the moment you walk through the door, not when you walk up to the microphone. How do you project your voice? Why is my voice so rich on air with this microphone? One, it's a fantastic mic, so that's helpful. I also understand that when I speak, my voice rises from my lungs and vibrates in my head because your head is full of holes. So if your voice is vibrating in your head, even if you speak softly, it will still project. So those are some of the things that we talk about in the book. And we also talk about imaginative circumstances. Allegra and I co-wrote this, but I spent some time talking about imaginative circumstances.
And
so,
what are they?
Well, imaginative circumstances would be me, instead of me saying whose woods these are, I think I know his house is in the village, though, I pause and think, okay, think of like whose woods these are. And I imagine snow. And I imagine being in the woods. And I imagine I'm in the sleigh, and I imagine what the horse smells like, and I imagine what time of day it is, and I imagine if I'm warm or cold, do I have a blanket? Am I wrapped in a good coat? Or did I end up in the middle of the winter with nothing on, and am I freezing? And why am I in a hurry? So those are all imaginary circumstances. Back to acting. That's what an actor would do. Imagine into the piece and then live it. It becomes alive in the body.
By the way, one of the things I also love about the book, first of all, I saw the title, picked it up. This looks like a cool book. You have one of the great subtitles. I love it. Stuff nobody teaches you.
Yes.
But a great line. And is it the other book you have that same subtitle?
Yeah, that's the line, the stuff nobody teaches you. So the how-to series, the stuff nobody teaches you.
But you're so on target because, again, I have had lots of authors on the show. I'm friends with lots of authors, and they all know how to write the book, but nobody ever thinks about you might have to present it,
Most people don't, and
Right.
I think it's a shame because, as Tebbe was talking about in the last hour, the last half hour, he does his work as a painter. So if you go to one of his shows, it's likely that he spent probably not as much time framing the pieces as he did painting them, or he might have spent as much time. When you go to the show, it looks great. The frames are fabulous. The lights look good. music is on, the flowers are on the table, you have some food to eat in the opening, and everybody dresses nicely, and it's a very pleasant evening. All people like to go to those things. Poets have the same phenomenon when they read their work. So their performance is their frame. So I would advise people who read to put the same amount of intention into creating the frame by way of the performances Tebbe would with putting a frame around his art.
Well, you raised a good point, which I never really thought about with respect to poets or writers, anybody, that you can say, well, you're just a poet, and you don't have to worry about performing it, but you're missing half of the thing if you don't get to perform it or get other people to listen to it if they just read it.
That's true, and it's perfectly acceptable if you have no intention and no interest in performing your work. Nobody says you have to, and it's perfectly reasonable to say, no, I prefer not to perform my work. I like to write it, and if you'd like to read it, here's my book. Fine. If you do decide to say yes to a public reading, for whatever reasons, maybe you think you need to do a public reading in order to get more visibility, to sell your work, whatever. The moment you make that decision, then these ideas around how to present it come into play. If you don't present your work publicly and you do it in a book that's beautifully designed, then the book itself is the frame. The design of the book becomes the frame.
Ken Blanchard, one of my favorite authors, management theorist, has a great line, and it seems to apply to poets as well. He says, if you don't toot your own horn, somebody else will use it as a spittoon. You know, so the point is you write poetry, but if you don't get to deliver it or present it or share it with others, it seems you're missing something.
Well, it's possible. I mean, that's an individual choice, and it's an artistic choice. And so sharing it with others, you can share it in many, many different ways, which to me brings up the idea of, and we're coming close to the top of the hour, so it's the idea of creative leadership. And we as creative people, you're on one side of the mic, I'm on the other, and everyone who's listening to this show probably has some interest in creativity. That's why they're listening to the show. So every creative effort you engage in to express your ideas, your thoughts, to me that's an act of creative leadership. And presenting your work to someone else individually, one-on-one, like you and I are one-on-one in the studio, maybe we're not so one-on-one on air because there are a lot of people listening to this. So I'll say something, it ripples out, you hear it, somebody else hears it, maybe it inspires them, that ripples from them, and those ripples are leadership ripples. They're very simple and very small. And often leadership is really small, not large and grand.
Exactly. It's just kind of start out one-to-one, and then it can expand. But go back to one last thing. It's a whole other show we'll do, Nave, on this. But you get some people who say, hey, this is great, poetry, writing, all this stuff, but they're not creative at all. How do you deal with that?
Oh, I say we're really not talking about creativity. Creativity is like air. It's everywhere. I mean, we actually have too much of it. There's too much creativity, if you will. Or actually, I shouldn't say there's too much. There's a lot of creativity, and we sometimes are overwhelmed by the abundance of creativity. Often what we're talking about when we write poetry or create art, like Tebbe making his paintings or me making my poems or Tebbe making his poems, talking about organization. How do you organize all of this abundance in a way that's meaningful for you? So when you say, I'm not creative, you really would have a hard time arguing that effectively, because we would not survive if we weren't able to make things and create. So we create all the time. We even create when we sleep and we dream. So how do you organize your creativity? How do you spend your day in that organization? Everybody does it differently.
Nava, if any of our listeners want to get in touch with you, either to find out about the book or your poetry slams, or you seem to do a lot of different stuff, best bet is to do what?
Oh, my website is jamesnave.com. Nave spelled N-A-V-E. If you want to email me, nave@jamesnave.com.
Okay, and you can also listen to your radio show, which is heard on WPVM.
WPVM.
And you'll find more about James Nave, who we're going to have to get back for a second time to talk just about creativity alone. That's a whole...
Oh, we could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about that, brother.
I was going to say that. Like, Nave for being my guest the second half hour on the Blaine's World Show. Also, Tebbe Davis for being my guest the first half hour. Also to Amy Prisnach, my producer, and to Zuzu Welsh, who provided the music you heard at the beginning of the show. You'll now be hearing at the end. I look forward to having you join me next Wednesday here on the new WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina. Or you can also listen to the rebroadcast on Saturdays at the same time. Also, please join us next week and listen online at WPVMFM.org. Or today, it looks like the show did click on WPVM's Facebook page, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for listening.